Hey there, Hour of History listeners. It's your host, Stephen Bauman. Do you ever sit and think about the relationship between the United States and China like I do? Maybe you don't, but you definitely get the headlines, check Twitter feeds, and see the news, and China is in the news all the time. Whether it's the United States president saying China repeatedly in campaign rallies, or political analysis on the ascendance of Xi Jinping. It could be the technology of Huawei or the educational Confucius Institutes. It could even be the Hour of History podcast on which we've talked about China numerous times. Well, this week, the same week as Lunar New Year, we have a guest on Hour of History, Dr. Gregg Brazinsky, professor of history and international affairs at George Washington University. Dr. Brazinsky has written some excellent books about China, winning the Third World, and Korea, nation building in South Korea, not to mention a bunch of new works that are coming out in the future. Dr. Brazinsky is also an active presence in the foreign policy community and has some excellent insight to offer on both the Cold War relationship between China and the United States, as well as the present day situation. So you're going to want to stick around for this episode. Please go to hourofhistory.com/subscribe so you get all of these episodes and some future enticing episodes directly to your mailbox every week. As usual, we also have recommendations for you. Those can be seen at hourofhistory.com/Rex, R-E-C-S. Thanks again for listening, and share this episode with anyone who's interested in foreign policy or China. On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place.
You're listening to the Hour of History podcast.
Our world, anytime, any place.
With your host, Stephen Bauman, and producer, James Abel. The Hour of History is a member of Episodic Network, an association of fun, interesting, and informative podcasts. EpisodicNetwork.com. Without further delay, your Hour of History starts right now.
Hello and welcome to Hour of History. This is your host, Stephen Bauman, and this week we have Dr. Gregg Brazinsky, professor of history and international affairs at George Washington University. It's a pleasure to have you, Dr. Brazinsky.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I first came into contact with your work actually in 2017 with your second book, Winning the Third World. But you've written, and that book focuses mostly on China-U.S. relations. You've also written about Korea. Can you just give our audience a little background of what you study?
Yes, well, I'm interested in U.S. East Asian relations, and I'm interested in East Asian international history. But I look at it not really only from the perspective of formal high-level diplomacy. I'm also very interested in social, economic, and cultural interactions, both between the United States and East Asia, and between and among the different East Asian states themselves.
And that becomes rather complicated, doesn't it, considering the, enormous diversity in East Asia. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, the languages you know, sort of how you came to study East Asia?
Sure. I first started working on South Korea when I was in graduate school, and at the time there actually weren't a lot of other people working on Korea at all. If you looked around the country, there were sort of maybe 5 or 6 people with tenure-track jobs in Korean history. And I noticed that there weren't really any good books on U.S.-Korean relations after the Korean War. There was some distinguished literature on the Korean War, but there was very little on U.S.-South Korean relations after the Korean War, and there was especially very little work on the subject that A, used Korean material, and B, used the most recent U.S. sources. So I decided this would be a great dissertation topic, and I started learning Korean. I studied several intensive summer programs at Yonsei University in South Korea. And the dissertation eventually became my first book. It's called Nation Building in South Korea. And the book really wrestles with the question of how did South Korea emerge as a prosperous democracy in the 20th century, and what role did the United States play in the process? And I finished that book, and I'd also been learning Mandarin Chinese, and I did that for a variety of different reasons. One is that I was very interested, and still am interested, in writing a book about the Korean War that looks at it from the perspectives of the US, Korea, and China. But I also realized that there was a lot that you can do with Mandarin Chinese. And I'd been working on the language, and that was sort of what got me into my second book. I had also been teaching a course entitled The Cold War in the Third World. And as I was putting together that course, one of the things that surprised me was that when you looked at US documents about Africa, what I saw was that the Americans were surprisingly concerned about China and Chinese influence in Africa. And I thought that this was a little bit weird at the time. I mean, how influential could the Chinese have actually been in Africa during the 60s? And I realized that it was just a sort of a bias that I had. And if you looked at Chinese policy in Africa during the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Chinese were actually very active. And so the effort I put into learning Mandarin was starting to pay off because there were also a lot of new materials about Chinese Cold War policy that I started to use in researching my second book.
Interesting. So do you think that oversight of historians not focusing on China's actions in Africa as much was ignorance or lack of materials more?
I think it was a combination of things. I think, part of it was that the first generation of Cold War historians focused heavily on US-Soviet rivalry, and they saw it as a bipolar conflict. I think part of it was the fact that in general, Cold War scholars didn't talk very much to Africa scholars. There wasn't that much work on the Cold War in Africa. And so for all of these reasons, I think people had missed this. And, then I realized as well, China's policies towards Africa were really a reflection of a broader Afro-Asianism.
And so by putting the focus, and this is kind of an interesting point, something that you do, putting the focus on this Afro-Asianism, this Chinese interaction with Africa, it is totally changing the focus, sort of flipping the globe upside down in the Cold War period, which is an interesting prospect considering we hear so much about the Soviet-US rivalry. Is that something that you still find to be productive, or do you do nod to the Soviet Union every so often in your book?
Right, absolutely. I mean, I'm not trying to write the Soviet Union out of the Cold War by any means. They were obviously an important player. Some people have said, well, you should have paid more attention to the Soviet Union. And, of course, everybody knows the Soviet Union was a significant actor. But my point was just that China was also a significant actor, and there were also certain places and times where it makes much more sense to look at China-US rivalry than it does to look at US-Soviet rivalry, and where Americans were much more concerned about Chinese influence than they were about Soviet influence. The other thing that I found interesting that you said is that point about how this sort of flips the Cold War world on its head. And that's actually one of the things that Americans were very afraid of at the time. The Chinese, because they were an Afro-Asian country and a non-white country, could somehow have greater influence in the global South, or that people in the global South would be more susceptible to Chinese influence, because the Russians were actually not doing that well in their diplomacy in Africa, and neither was the United States. And the same could be said to a certain extent about parts of Southeast Asia. And so there really was this concern that the Chinese could make inroads and have influence in places that European countries and the United States or even the Soviet Union could not. And I think Chinese influence in the Afro-Asian world really combined America's greatest fears during the Cold War. On the one hand, a socialist, revolutionary, non-liberal democratic movement, while at the same time combined with people of color in both Asia and Africa being unified against the West.
And it's fair to say that the foreign policy experts of the United States at the time what was their understanding of China?
Well, I actually think American policymakers did see China as a threat. At times they saw it as a greater threat than the Soviet Union, which is something that's forgotten. I think, in the book, one of the things that I argue is that Americans often exaggerated the Chinese threat, that they tended to make it out to be greater than it was. And I think that was also, that was also part of the problem of American foreign policy during the Cold War, that it took this exaggerated view of the Chinese threat. And this led to some policies which actually ended up being very counterproductive.
As someone who has access to more Chinese viewpoints than, say, the average American or even the average American foreign policy creator, policy maker, would you say some of those perceptions were created in an ignorance of Chinese views, or is that sort of the Chinese project to sort of mask these goals?
I don't think that the Chinese were trying to mask their goals at least during the Cold War. I think you could, maybe accuse China of that a little bit more now, although there's actually a lot of debate over, how ambitious China actually is in, Asian and African countries today. I don't think that I don't think it's really the case that China was trying to mask or hide its ambitions. They spoke, very openly during the 1950s and 1960s about the need for a worldwide anti-imperialist, anti-American revolution. And, Chinese also tended to see themselves very naturally as a country that could be a leading force in this kind of revolution, because from their perspective, they had a history of successfully overcoming imperialism. They had a history of successful nation building that, other countries in Asia and Africa didn't quite have at the time.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And bringing in empire and sort of this reaction to what's called the century of dishonor, of sort of foreign, tearing apart China. Does that put you at odds with people who are kind of arguing, China is trying to go back to these old dynastic traditions?
Right. I mean, one of the things that I've argued both in the book and elsewhere is that if you look at Chinese foreign policy today, it actually has more to do with its Cold War era foreign policy than it does with, say, the Ming Dynasty or the Qing Dynasty. I think, history is never irrelevant, and I'm not saying we shouldn't look at I'm not saying we shouldn't look at, the prior centuries, but I think there's a tendency to exaggerate the influence of the Ming and Qing dynasty and the tributary system, so-called tributary system, because a lot of the most recent scholarship actually argues that the tributary system was nothing like the first generation of American sinologists depicted it as. I think if you look at a lot of the things that China says and does, there's definitely echoes of, there's definitely echoes of what it was doing during the Cold War. The idea that, and again, sometimes Chinese officials don't talk about it explicitly, but the idea that China has something to offer Afro-Asian countries, a way of development and modernization that's different to and maybe more suited to peoples in Asia and Africa than what the United States can offer. I think that kind of thinking still informs Chinese policy in parts of Asia and Africa today, and it did in many ways during the Cold War as well. So that's one parallel that I've drawn. I think if you look at things like that, the ideas, some of the connections, I mean, they come much more from China's emergence as a modern nation state over the course of the 20th century, and especially during the Cold War, than they do to the old, to like Ming Dynasty traditions or, Qing Dynasty traditions.
Mm-hmm. And so as China emerges into this new role, they both serve as potentially an example and an influencer for these countries that are in what we can call the third world or the developing world. Did you find in your research that countries are mostly receptive to China or more receptive to, say, America in these kind of situations?
Well, I think that varied quite a bit. It depended on what country you're talking about. It depended on what time period you're talking about. And I would say, the same thing very much applies today. It depends on what the indigenous leadership looks like. It depends on a lot of things. But I do think, one of the arguments that I make absolutely is that China had some degree of appeal to people in the Afro-Asian world at the time. The United States would have liked them to, certainly. And, part of this is because of, China's history, and a lot of people peoples and leaders in Asia and Africa really did look at China and say, their experience is a lot closer to ours than the United States is. And even countries that were, relatively pro-Western, there were still countries among them that said, well, we welcome American aid, but we don't want, but that doesn't mean there's nothing that we could learn from China. It doesn't mean we shouldn't have any relationship with China.
Right. This sounds like some of that delicious complexity that historians love to give things that, people are kind of hesitant. They want an easy story.
Right. They want a clear narrative.
Exactly. So with that in mind, can we then talk a little bit about your approach? And this is something that I'm currently, going through as I'm working on my own projects, is deciding how deep you want to go on one case. So like in your first book, you're writing about nation building in South Korea. And so you have a clear sort of interaction, at least on the surface, clear, between the United States and South Korea. Whereas in the second book, you're looking at much larger geographic region. Can you talk a little bit about the different approaches, the choice to approach those in different ways, and some of the things you've learned from that?
Right. Well, I mean, in general, as historians, we always have a question of how broadly do you want to cast your lens? And, I finished after my first book, which I think it wasn't as narrow as some dissertation books. It still sought to address a pretty big question. I sort of wanted to do something broader. But, I also have to say, when I first started it, I didn't really completely understand how expansive Chinese ambitions and policy in the Third World were. So I didn't think I was actually researching and writing quite as long a book as I was actually researching and writing. I would sort of write parts of it, and then I'd be like, oh, there's something missing. And then I'd realize, well, I actually needed another chapter on the 1950s to connect, the mid 1950s and the late 1950s. And so, I went through a lot of that when I was writing as well. And so that's also something that I sort of came to understand as I was writing the book. I guess I didn't realize, I somehow thought that there might have been a few instances of Sino-U.S. competition, and I could just sort of focus on those. But then as I looked at it, I was, China really was, seeking to spread revolution in Asia pretty broadly at times. And, so that was one aspect that interested me, and one of the reasons that the book, just started to grow and grow. And, also I started to realize, where does it begin? At first, I told you I found those documents about Chinese influence in Africa during the 1960s. And I said, okay, I can write a book about Sino-American rivalry during the 1960s. No one's done that. And then I said, I started looking back and said, oh, but there's also all of this material about China and Southeast Asia during the 1950s. And there's all of these, American policy documents expressing fear about Chinese influence in Asia during the 1950s. So that went in. And then I started thinking about, where did it all start? Sure, it sort of starts in Korea. Korea is really the war that made sort of a tense relationship between the United States and Communist China in 1949 into a rivalry that would last for a couple of decades. So Korea was one logical place, but I thought, if you really want to understand the origins, the ideas that drove China and its influence and its efforts to influence Afro-Asian countries during the Cold War, you had to look even further back. You had to look at this period between 1919 and 1945, and you needed to look at some aspects of the development and articulation of Maoism during that time.
Mm-hmm. So it's important, you're lengthening also the time period that we have to consider.
Yes.
Going back further, now, was the gravitational pull towards Latin America something that you resisted, or that you didn't find in Chinese expansion plans or Chinese?
Right. I think that's interesting. Again, one of the things I don't talk about Chinese efforts to influence Latin America in the book. It's not because they're non-existent. It's because I wanted to make the book about China-American competition. So where were they actually competing? Not only did China say it wanted to be influential, or did China have aspirations, but also where was the United States actually worried about what China was doing? It is also, very much the case that in Latin America, probably the most important revolutionary may have been Castro, right? Mm-hmm. And if you look at American policy documents from the 60s, a lot of times when they talk about Latin America, they're not worried about Maoism. They're worried much more about Cuba and Castro extending their influence. And, so that was one of the reasons that I didn't write about Latin America as much. China certainly hoped to see, revolution in Latin American countries. It definitely hoped that the continent would, turn would turn against the United States. But it also sort of recognized, I would say, Cuba, that Cuba would probably be a more important factor in that than China would.
Interesting. Yeah, it seems like a lot of historians of diplomacy and foreign policy are being more and more drawn into global histories. Sort of.
Yes.
Yeah. So the competition and time are two interesting things you mentioned there that I would like to talk more about. Maybe we'll start with time, and that'll lead us to competition. Throughout this conversation, and I find the temptation myself, we keep going sort of back and forth, or at least there's the temptation that we want to talk about now. But your book is specifically about the Cold War. In what ways has writing that book, does your book inform now, and how do you sort of resist the temptation to always be drawn into the present?
Right, and as I said, I didn't. When I wrote the book and started researching it, I didn't say, well, geez, there's a lot of competition between China and the United States in Africa today. There's a lot of competition today. Let's go write a history of that. That wasn't really the genesis of this project. The genesis of the project was much more in the new archival material that became available. And, you know, in the conclusion, I sort of try to fashion the book into, you know, or I wouldn't say fashion the whole book, but I try to draw some linkages between what was going on during the Cold War and the present day. But it wasn't really an effort to explain what's going on in the present in any way, shape, or form. I think it has, I think the book has policy implications, certainly. I think it's a history that people who work on China issues today should pay attention to, and that they don't pay enough attention to. But it wasn't necessarily my motive for writing the book. And so I think, I think that was one of the things that sort of enabled me to avoid being too presentist in writing it.
And you're at an interesting position as a professor of both, history and international affairs. What is your perspective on that? When you see this constant stream of news, I mean, if we go onto Google News right now and just search China, there will be thousands of stories, all making some sort of historical connection. How do you interact with that?
Well, I would say a couple of things. One is, people sometimes accuse me of being a panda hugger, but I think one of the things that comes across in my book is that exaggerating the Chinese threat was never productive for the United States and American policymakers. And it does, one of the things that looks at, I look at today that bothers me and distresses me is that there's a tendency both in the corporate media and among the policymakers to never give China the benefit of the doubt. And I'm not saying, there's nowhere that China is a strategic competitor. I'm not saying that, they're always the good guys. Yes, they're an authoritarian society where human rights and freedom of the press isn't respected. But that doesn't mean that it's always a threat. One instance where I disagree with policymakers is when it comes to Confucius Institutes, which China has been funding at a lot of American universities. I think you really have to look at what these Confucius Institutes do when they're on the ground, which is mostly teach language. And even if, perhaps the textbooks do present a relatively optimistic portrait of China. I mean, that's possible when you get to maybe advanced language learning textbooks. But I think you also have to consider that China is sending young people to the United States, and that their experiences in the United States and meeting American students is going to have an influence on them too. And so, I think that kind of exchange is worthwhile to continue, because if you have them and you actually have faith in America's political system and in its values, then I think exchanges will always work in America's benefit in the long term. Because if our values and ideals really are worthy of emulation, people will see that. The Chinese who come to the United States through these Confucius Institute programs will see that. And, I don't see them as sort of a nefarious effort to, brainwash young Americans into, thinking that the Chinese way of life is a good way of life, or better than the American way of life, or making them lose faith in democracy. I mean, realistically, no one with any brain who goes and spends time in China is going to lose faith in democracy. If anything, it makes you, more appreciative of it. And I think, so I tend to favor exchange programs and other means that can be seen as sort of trust building. I think that kind of interaction is something that we very much need. But you see a lot of hardliners saying, no, we need to get China out of this and out of that. I just don't think that's the best approach. I think often it only convinces the Chinese that, the U.S. is trying to reestablish the old 100 years of humiliation. And, it doesn't really help to, it doesn't really help to improve mutual understanding, and it doesn't help to change the way Chinese think.
What would you say about, I think all those points are very well taken, and in a couple previous episodes, we've talked a little bit about Confucius Institutes before, but now I'm thinking kind of the reverse. There's also this movement of American universities. One of the early examples is something like NYU Shanghai.
Right.
But this is happening all over now. I mean, there are a lot of American universities that are opening these campuses that are, they're accredited in the United States, but this is not like a Confucius Institute type exchange, right? This is a corporate investment.
Right.
So would you say that is a similarly positive exchange, or do you see this as more kind of nefarious competition that's coming out of the ground?
I mean, I don't see them as necessarily part of a competition. I mean, I think with places like NYU Shanghai, the Chinese government wants it to be there, and Americans, I think the United States and American universities want it to be there. Mm-hmm. For now, I think going to a place like NYU Shanghai is probably, a very interesting experience for, the Chinese students who go there. I've been over there once, but, I think the Chinese government is not able to interfere with a lot of aspects of instruction and curriculum at, these institutions, as it is in, other places within China. At least that's my perception. But, I think the most basic thing that you notice right away is you walk into the buildings at NYU Shanghai and you get on Twitter and Facebook without a problem. Whereas I'm in like my Western tourist hotel and I'm like sitting there frustrated. So I think that they provide a measure of access and a kind of communication that I think is good and has a lot of benefits. And I do think there can actually be things that are mutually beneficial in the United States and China. We always talked about mutually beneficial cooperation in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. It's just suddenly in the last decade where this idea that, China is going to eat our lunch has really started to take hold in the policy, in the policy community and in the corporate media to some degree. And it's something, again, that I find worrisome and often wrong-headed.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think is cool, and a link to your Twitter handle will certainly be in the show notes, is that you're actively kind of combating this on Twitter. Like when you see an article that does this, you will make a historian's kind of response, which I think is really good for historians, and it's good for people consuming the news, and you kind of fact check them. And I think that's awesome. One of the things I wanted to ask about the exchanges is China sends an enormous amount of students to the United States. So anyone who's taught at a university or even been to a university in the last 10 or 20 years in the United States has noticed this. Is there any sort of reciprocal kind of thing happening between China and Africa, or China and the rest of Asia? And were these links built in that Cold War period?
One is, I do think some of the links that were built during the Cold War period inform current Chinese policy. I mean, just if you look at something Xi Jinping has said, even very recently, he goes to African countries and he says, our interest in Africa goes back to the Bandung Conference, right? You hear him say that a lot, and so. I do think that there's, today Chinese influence is very different, obviously, than it was, but I still think that there's certain commonalities in how China perceives itself and, some of how it wants to be perceived. In terms of universities, that's, a complex issue. I think a degree from the United States carries a kind of prestige in China, and I think that's one of the reasons why there's an NYU Shanghai, and other American universities are are allowed to set up campuses in China. Russian universities aren't. There's no Moskva State University, Beijing, or anything like that, and I think it reflects. It reflects in a lot of ways the strengths of our system of higher education. A lot of people like to knock it, but I think despite its blemishes, it also has a lot of good points. But you see, I think you see a lot of exchange students in China from around the world, certainly. And you do see, a good number of Chinese studying in some countries aside from the United States. Canada is obviously one, and Europe is parts of Europe are also places where you see a lot of Chinese students, especially in London, and other English-speaking countries. You also see a lot of Chinese students in Japan and South Korea these days.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that is sort of like a long-term goal, is to eventually sort of get the kind of status that American or British universities have? That seems to be something that universities elsewhere in the world have really struggled to do. I mean, in Korea is a good example. Korea has some excellent universities, Seoul, Yonsei, Kodae, but it's still hard to market a Korean university to, say, an American student. Does China have a status envy for that kind of thing, or a goal to create a similar product?
Perhaps, but I think I think every country that has higher education wants its universities to do great research, and sees them as very important. But I think, I do think the Chinese government is realistic enough, and most Chinese that I talk to are realistic enough to sort of understand that, Chinese universities aren't going to overtake American universities overnight or anytime soon. They are improving in a lot of ways, but American universities have a very big head start in terms of the resources they've already compiled, in terms of years of experience with certain kinds of instruction, and I think there's also the fact that often the most brilliant Chinese scholars who study here don't go back. They stay in the United States. So I think universities in South Korea are good. They are improving. The same in China. I do think over time you see more Americans studying in China and South Korea, but I do think it's not it's more limited. Most Americans, will study in Korea. They'll study in like the Graduate School of International Studies, but they're going to do a PhD in engineering in the United States if they can. Mm-hmm. So, mostly the people who spend time at Chinese or Korean universities are the people like me who want to know about China and Korea.
So as long as America has this kind of, in a lot of ways, it is an exceptional education system. Is American influence really ever going to be offset? And if it is something like technology going to be a way that it happens, an area where it seems like competition is a little more lively?
Right. I mean, absolutely. I think technology is an area where China is obviously catching up with the United States. I think, but to what degree does it offset American influence? It's hard to say. When you look at something like automobiles, Japan, Japanese automobiles probably, have overtaken American-made cars in a lot of parts of both the domestic and the international market. Does it mean, though, that Japan is necessarily replacing the United States as a hegemon or a superpower? Not really. Obviously the Chinese case is different, but, just the point is that technology or taking over in particular, becoming stronger than the United States in certain industries doesn't mean you're going to replace American influence. I think when you get into that question of influence, it's sort of a really multifaceted one, because it also, refers to sort of what kind of influence are you talking about, right? Is it going to replace democratic values? In certain places, that's going to be pretty hard to do. Right? Mm-hmm. Is it something that will, displace some American companies? Sure. But influence on the whole, I don't think so. I think, one of the things when you look at the United States, often it's at its best when it doesn't try to proselytize too much, or doesn't try to contest Chinese influence too vigorously. Let the Chinese, do business and seek to improve its relations with countries throughout the world, and the United States can do the same thing. But it's not always a zero-sum game. There's, areas and issues where the U.S. and China have to work together. And so, one of my fears is that we will let our sort of obsession with China as a threat overcome and weaken the areas or weaken weaken sort of the impetus to cooperate and get along and work together where we need to.
And do you see? So there is the threat, and that seems to be something that media loves to play up. Just today there was a 5G in New York Times writing the 5G is the new arms race with China. Just sort of making that competition a negative thing. But do you think, in addition to that, the combination of that fear plus the situation that's happening in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs and the education camps, do those play off each other? Are those totally separate issues? Do you find people are using sort of the human rights issue as an advantage in competition?
Well, I think, it's sort of interesting because that is one of the points that I talk about in my book, as China competed for global influence, one of the things that hurt it more than anything else were, the issues of Xinjiang and Tibet. During the Cold War, more so Tibet. I think in the present day, Tibet is still an issue, but right now we hear a lot about Xinjiang and the Uyghurs. I do think these are things that hurt China's image internationally, especially in Buddhist countries and Muslim countries, places where the United States really sees itself as a competitor towards China. I think, I mean, one of the things during the Cold War is the United States didn't have to do that much on these issues. They did try to exploit it, but a lot of times it was, they found that, people knew about it and that China's image was being hurt as a result. And the United States was actually best off if it didn't go around, broadcasting it too much or propagandizing about it too much. Give the Chinese propaganda apparatus a rope and let it hang itself, right? Yeah. I think with Xinjiang and the Uyghurs, and more broadly, problems with China's ethnic minorities and human rights. All of these are going to be problems for China and its international image going forward.
Mm-hmm. And, it seems China is equipping itself, or at least thinking about those to a certain extent. Xi Jinping is now in a position of influence that we haven't necessarily seen. He's much more powerful than his predecessors. Right. Does this bring you back to the Cold War at all?
I think one of the things I find interesting is Xi Jinping himself. Has at times sort of expressed admiration for Mao, and what was Mao's legacy? It's quite complicated and confused, and still something that Chinese haven't completely found a good way to talk about. But I think so I think there's an aspect of it, but there's some element of that, but there's also some dimensions of what Xi Jinping is doing that are new and that reflects sort of different ways of trying to centralize power in the hands of the party. I mean, you've had, more than, 40 years now of economic experimentation and change. And so there's still, I think they're still sort of struggling to answer the question of, how do you do, a market economy with socialist characteristics, right? What is the role of the state? I think there's still a lot of debate over that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's certainly going to be an interesting situation. It reminds me of that Mark Twain, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes.
Right, but it does rhyme, yes.
Yeah, it does rhyme. And so we've spent a lot of time in the present now. I'd love to hear, without, giving it away, about some of the work you're doing now. You mentioned the Korean War and maybe a different perspective on it.
Right. Well, I'm actually still not on the Korean War quite. I owe the Smith Richardson Foundation a book on American nation building in Asia, which I promised them I would write a while ago, and I'm still very much working on that. And I've actually now been learning Japanese because I realize you can't tell the complete story of American nation building in Asia without Japanese, and there's a lot of new Japanese material. So that's, a project that's coming along a little bit more slowly than I would like, but it is coming along. I'm also working on a book which is, coming along as well on China and North Korean relations during the Cold War. And I guess when I was doing the archival research for my previous book, I found interesting materials about North Korea in the archives. And I just, I had to have it. So I copied a lot of that too. And so I sort of started thinking, there's a part, there's some very interesting stuff that can be done with this. And, I've since also been looking at some of the North Korean periodicals at the Library of Congress. And I just find it interesting. I think the China-North Korea relationship is also something that's been very deeply misunderstood. Trump came out early in his presidency, and he was like, well, we're going to get China to solve the North Korea problem for us. And I was just, you can read my tweets from back then, and I said, no, they're not. China is never going to completely abandon North Korea, and why was that? And I think it's not just interests. There's also a cultural aspect to it, and I'm trying to uncover that in my current research as well. Finally, I should mention one more thing that I'm happy about is I have an edited volume that should be out soon. It's a volume on Korea and the world that collects essays by who I consider some of the best young scholars working on Korea and Korean international history, Korean international politics, and it's just it's organized around the theme of what have Korea's global interactions and global involvement been like, both historically and in the present. And so, I think that's also going to be a good volume for people who want to read, some fresh perspectives on Korea.
You are indeed a busy man. And I can't believe, the time is flying by, and we didn't even really approach talking about North Korea. And I sort of remember, I'll just sort of, before we get to our suggestion, I'll sneak this question in. You tweeted recently, a couple days ago was the Holocaust Remembrance Day, and you tweeted about this memory of that seems to be an East Asian thing that is like just this historical memory that doesn't go away, where the Japanese will not apologize for the comfort women, and Korea and China will continue to have this sort of frustration, anger with Japan. Does this make Asia sort of exceptional? Is this historical memory ever going to be resolved?
I don't know if it makes Asia exceptional. I think, will it be resolved is a difficult question. I think it makes such sense for Japan to follow a tact on this issue that's more similar to what Germany has done, and show remorse and show unambiguous remorse. I think if Japan did that, it would be, it would benefit both Japan, and it would benefit, the overall strength of democratic institutions and values in Asia. If you look at Japan and South Korea, politically, they're both countries that, they share common values at the political level, and to some degree in terms of their way of doing things economically. They share these things, but they can't cooperate as friends, because on these historical issues and nationalist issues, South Korea shares more with China. A history of a history of suffering under Japanese colonialism. So it's completely incomprehensible to me why Japan wouldn't want to try to strengthen its ties with South Korea instead of pushing South Korea closer to China. It just doesn't make sense. And so, will it be resolved? I don't know. I think it will take new political leadership in Japan, because the current political leaders, I don't think they're budging very much on the issue.
Yeah, it'll be an interesting thing to watch. I was at the Holocaust Museum for the Remembrance Day ceremony on Friday, and one of the most moving speeches was actually made by the German ambassador to the United States. And just to sort of comprehend that, that the German ambassador was standing there talking about this sort of struggle that Germans have had to come to terms with this event that happened in the 20th century.
Right, and I think that kind of soul-searching hasn't quite taken place in Japan, and it should. I do think in the Japanese left, it has to some degree. I mean, you read also, people like Haruki Murakami's work, and you can see that they struggle with the colonial past. But I think more broadly in society, I don't think it has. And I always, whenever I bring these points up, I always get a lot of sort of nasty emails and, nasty responses, so.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll be on the lookout for them. So the hour has flown by, and we're now to the point in the show where we make a suggestion. It can be anything under the sun that the Hour of History listeners will surely check out. Would you like to go first?
Right. Well, I would say in terms of Asian history, I actually have a couple of books that are, they're academic books, but I think they speak very much to contemporary policy issues, and I think they deserve more attention. One is called A Misunderstood Friendship. And this is a book by the great Chinese scholar of the Korean War, Shen Zhihua, and an American scholar, Yafeng Xia. They sort of worked together to take Professor Shen's insights and put them in a way that's that's sort of a little bit more tailored for an American audience. I don't agree with everything they say in the book, but you can learn so much about the China and North Korean relationship from that book. So I think anyone who works on China and North Korea, they need to read that book. Another book, an academic book that sort of came to mind, is Jiang Li's China's Hegemony, which is a recent book that talks about the relationship between China and Korea during the dynastic period. And again, today you hear so much nonsense spoken about, like, what was it, the tributary system, and, how China completely dominated Korea during this period. And, Jiang's book shows it was more complex than that. So those are two books that I've sort of read closely in sort of preparing for what, the book on China and North Korea that I'm writing now. And I think, I could recommend a lot of more popular books, but these are two academic books that deserve more attention.
Fantastic. Thank you for those suggestions. Those are definitely going to be linked to at hourofhistory.com/rex, as well as the show notes. My suggestion is, it's based on the time we're having this conversation. The Lunar New Year is coming up, and no matter where you are in the world, I'm pretty confident you could find a Lunar New Year celebration, and I think it would be extremely rewarding to go celebrate that and sort of interact with people from Asia, whether they be from China or elsewhere. For example, in Washington, D.C., at the Kennedy Center, they have folk music, and these events are free, taking place midweek next week. So go out there, listeners, find a cultural event and just talk to people. And I think that makes a huge step. And then I'm also going.
I'm sorry. There's actually a Lunar New Year's party at this Thursday.
Awesome.
It might be, this might be put up too late for your listeners, but that's being hosted by our Confucius Institute and the GW Institute for Korean Studies.
Oh, great. That's this Thursday, the
31st. Yes.
The 31st. Okay, so we'll release some promo info right before, kind of tease the episode on Saturday, and I'll be sure to link to that as well. That's fantastic. And anytime you can have those interactions, I've found them to be greatly rewarding in my life. So that's it. Wow, there was a lot there. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Gregg Brazinsky. It was a pleasure to have you on Hour of History.
Okay, thank you for having me.
All right. Thanks again for listening to Hour of History. On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place.
Thanks again for listening. Make sure to check out hourofhistory.com/Rex for all the recommendations mentioned during the show. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. And if you still haven't gotten your fill of the Hour of History, be sure to head over to our blog at hourofhistory.com/blog, where you'll find topics that were covered in the podcast as well as others. And that concludes this week's episode. We thank you again for listening, and we hope to have you back here next week at the Hour of History podcast.
Who wants stickers? Who wants stickers? Hour of History podcast stickers. If that, piques your interest, if you like sticking things where they don't belong, then go ahead and drop us a line. Go to hourofhistory.com/contact and leave us your name, your email address, and your address, and we'll pop some stickers in your mailbox. hourofhistory.com/contact. On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place.